floor. So first of all, our panel, who you see in front of you. On my left is Michael Hunter, who is Professor Emeritus of History at Birkbeck College, London, and the author, among many other things, of The Decline of Magic, Britain and the Enlightenment, and a lot of indispensable work, I add, on Boyle. He's much more broad in his interests than someone like me. Secondly, we have Alan Macfarlane, who's Emeritus Professor of Anthropological Science in the University of Cambridge, and as well as working in China, Japan and Nepal, he's the author of numerous works on English history, including his first famous book, Witchcraft in Tudor and Stuart England. And then we have Jan Machielsen, who is Senior Lecturer in Early Modern History at Cardiff, and the author, among other things, of The War on Witchcraft, published in this year, a study of early witchcraft historiography. Then there's Sophie Page, who's Professor of History at University College London and has published extensively on European medieval magic and astrology, including the recent Routledge History of Medieval Magic. And finally, but not least, Alex Walsham, who's Professor of Modern History in the University of Cambridge and the author, I'm told here, of at least half a dozen books covering nearly all aspects of religion in early modern England. So that's the panel. And I'll say something about myself. I'm Paul Slack, now Emeritus Professor of Early Modern Social History at Oxford, and I publish books on plague and urban history and economic improvement in the early modern period. But I started my career in Oxford reading history as an undergraduate pupil of Keith's, which was itself a formative experience, as you might imagine, way back in the early 1960s, before the book appeared, long before the book appeared. We had, as undergraduates, we had some hint of Keith's own historical interests, of course. Things like concepts of honour tended to crop up in tutorials on Richelieu and duelling, but we had little idea of the likely scope of his major work until the appearance of the famous article on history and anthropology in Past and Present in 1963, at the end of my second year. That famous essay, which caused something of a stir when it appeared, was about much more than religion and magic, of course, and it prepared us for a book which would open up equally large historical vistas. Religion and the Decline of Magic has done that and inspired other historians to follow Keith's lead and discover more. In my own work, for example, on plague and epidemic disease, I was prompted to look at social responses to epidemics and how they varied over time between different kinds of community, and how and why practices like quarantine took hold in some societies and not in others. And later in my work on urbanisation and economic improvement, I naturally looked again at what Keith had written about insurance and its roots in the later 17th century, and I found out more about the pivotal figure of Nicholas Barbon and some of his contemporaries and their intellectual makeup. I'm not alone in this, of course. There are many other historians who've worked on topics like funerals, crime and civility, not to mention science, and being stimulated by religion and the decline of magic in much the same way. So the legacy of that book embraces much more than its title. However, religion and magic are perhaps more than enough to be going on with, as we've seen in the course of the day. So I will ask the other members of the panel to describe themselves and their work in less than 5 minutes.
So, for 30 years, prior to my retirement in 2011, I taught courses at Birkbeck, University of London, on topics like the history of witchcraft or a master's course on the decline of magic. For these, my principal reading recommendation was always Religion and the Decline of Magic, which proved infallibly reliable. Obviously, the book has a huge appeal through its title and subject matter. It also has a great lucidity, which makes it accessible to students in a way that many academic books aren't. Birkbeck students are a feisty bunch and make no secret of their distaste for works that fail by this standard. The book was invariably the key to a good seminar. It could be relied upon not only to provide a vast amount of information through the innumerable examples that it succinctly recounts, but also to stimulate discussion through the telling and often controversial asides with which this is interspersed. The origins of the book go back to the 1960s, as Paul has said, and it's tempting to try to speculate on the stages through which it took shape. Perhaps Sir Keith will elucidate this in his concluding remarks. It seems to have begun as a collection of data on magical beliefs that could be elucidated through anthropological parallels, witchcraft, divination, ghosts and omens and the like. But this seems inexorably to have raised the issue of how contemporaries experience religion, to which an equal and no less absorbing amount of space is devoted. The book set itself the task of illustrating how thoroughly contemporaries were convinced by a set of beliefs which, in the words of its preface, are now all rightly disdained by intelligent persons. It's important to understand the extent to which, when it was published, the book was addressed to an audience of historians who were instinctively sceptical about the significance of its subject matter. On the whole, Thomas was very successful in his task, though certain questions arise concerning his range and coverage. In particular, although astrology receives full treatment, the related pursuit of alchemy is merely glanced at, mainly in the chapters on magic and religion, and that entitled Some Interconnections, which is itself one of the least satisfactory parts of the book. Yet, by illustrating the vitality of magical beliefs in early modern England to a greater extent than any previous historian, Thomas created a problem for himself in accounting for their subsequent fortunes, their decline, which he had evidently not anticipated when he embarked on the work. One of the weaknesses of the book is that, considering its title, its account of the decline of magic is surprisingly perfunctory. Only 2 chapters are devoted to this topic, comprising just 42 pages out of a book that runs to over 700. And it's salutary to recall that the work seems to have acquired its memorable title at a surprisingly late stage in its preparation. In Alan Macfarlane's influential study, Witchcraft in Tudor and Stuart England, published in 1970, just 1 year before Religion and the Decline of Magic, Thomas's forthcoming work is referred to with the title Primitive Beliefs in Pre-Industrial England. This obviously has a slightly crude edge, by which I know that Sir Keith is now embarrassed, but it might well be felt that it better describes the work's content than does the more evocative title that it subsequently acquired. In my 2020 book, The Decline of Magic, I attempted to address key aspects of the manner and milieu in which attitudes towards magic changed during the 18th century. In the course of this, I hope I've illustrated how much can be achieved through the detailed analysis of individual cases, that micro-study, the absence of which from Religion and the Decline of Magic was famously regretted by E.P. Thompson in his review of the book. But I would be the first to admit that my findings may not add much to Thomas's brilliant synthesis in his concluding chapter, in which intellectual and technical changes are left balanced against what he describes as new aspirations. There can be no doubt of the formidable achievement that we're here to celebrate. Thank you.
So imagine yourself in my position. I was Keith's first DPhil student, his only DPhil student, and so for 3 years I was subjected to the full rigour of Keith Thomas, where every few weeks I would be subjected to detailed analysis of what I got wrong in my study of witchcraft. Now I come back many years later, and my natural recourse when thinking about this paper was just to say what a wonderful man Keith is and what a fantastic book it is, which is all true. So that's what I was going to do, and I've passed around to you, I hope you've all got it, there's some copies if you haven't, of my reasons for thinking that. Because I quote Tocqueville, a revolution, once it's occurred, becomes invisible. And those of you who weren't living through that revolution won't know, and Robin referred to this, what an amazing change it was. I lived through it. I read Keith very kindly let me read some of the early drafts of the thesis, and I recounted in my letters to my parents and others what I felt about reading that, and then what I felt when I first read it. And I said, you know, it's a great work on the level of Tawney and Namier and Mark Bloch, which it is. That's my first reaction, and that's all I was going to say. But Keith wrote to me when I sent him this, and he said, I hope I'll get some punchy comments. So I'm going to give some punchy comments. But 10 years on, I wrote the review for History Today, which is also on the sheet that I've circulated. There I'm beginning to express some doubts. I mean, we had the doubts at the beginning because both of us agreed we didn't know why witchcraft declined or magic declined. We discussed this a number of times and we agreed. And indeed, in the letter from Keith you have here, it says, it's a pity anthropologists don't throw any light on the decline. So I had my doubts, and in that article, I sort of allude to them. I allude to the fact that Keith's book was already, in terms of anthropology, out of date. The famous review by Hildred Geertz points this out. Anthropology has moved on. Keith has provided a very good ethnography, but the theoretical framework of structural functionalism, which I was using too, is out of date now. We have structuralism, we have Marxism, and so on. So Keith's theoretical framework was already dead 10 years later. Then, moving on to 30 years on, I was asked to contribute to Keith's Festschrift, edited by Paul and others. And here I express a deeper doubt, which is that basically the whole Marx-Weber enchanted magical world to modern rational world framework doesn't work. Doesn't work with Weber. We know many societies are still filled with religion, and it doesn't work generally. It's a developmental project which comes out of the late 19th century, very similar to Fraser's magic, religion and science framework. Neither of them work. The world is not in stages like that. So the whole framework which I'd used and Keith used doesn't work at all because we now don't believe in that. Now that left me with the puzzle. Neither of us had solved the major problems. We were using the wrong methodology. The third and final and the fourth stage is basically now. During COVID, I've spent a lot of time thinking around these issues, and I've written a number of books, and I've published, at least on the internet, some hundreds of interviews which are referred to at the end here about this problem of enchantment and disenchantment and magic. And the basic thing I think I've discovered is the solution to this problem of what I often termed as the Weber-Kellner problem of the disenchantment of the world. How can we have both rationality, a rational scientific world, and meaning, which was Weber's problem? And I think it's by changing the word magic. I think magic is a hopeless word for various reasons. So the word I use now is enchantment. And what I came up with, and this was based on many years field work in Nepal, and particularly in China and Japan, they live, as Chris says, most of the world lives in an enchanted world. We are the minority, particularly the Anglosphere. Even Europe is more enchanted than we are. But basically, if you change the word, what you realise is that it's not a matter of before and after. It's a matter of yin and yang, backwards and forwards. And in the yin-yang symbols, yin has a bit of yang. So the medieval period in England had plenty of rationality, as we're learning from everyone here. And modernity has plenty of enchantment. And in the books I've been writing, I guess that all of us spend more of our time in enchantment, defined by the way I define it, which is basically that you live in your imagination, in an integrated imagination. And I analyse how we do this through play, through sports, through arts, through games, through television. So most human beings, we think of ourselves as rational. We are not at all rational. We are enchanted for most of our time. It's just, and what has happened through history is a shift, just a shift in the balance, back and forth. And we're now living in a shift back, as people have pointed out, towards a more enchanted world. Thank you.
Thank you to the organisers for inviting me, and it's a privilege to be in this company. So I brought along as my kind of talisman my copy, Religion and the Decline of Magic, which I acquired late on in my undergraduate degree, at the same time as I was choosing to write my dissertation on the astrologer Richard Trewithian, who is happily footnoted as one of the earliest private practitioners of astrology here. But it's also got, this book has my annotations from my PhD, which was on monks interested in magic in the Middle Ages, and so I was looking for other examples of clerics interested in magic. So it's been inspiring me for a long time. This morning I was looking at a manuscript in Old Souls that was also owned, medical manuscript owned by the medieval astrologer. I also want to say that this book, and I think also Peter's book on Magician, Witch and the Law, Richard Kiekewer's Magic in the Middle Ages, these are the books that created a space within medieval history for this to become an academic field that you could go into and be an expert in, as I am. It was really difficult to find a dissertation supervisor when I was an undergraduate, and I had to change, and I changed dissertation topic, but there the field was being created by this book and others. So I'm going to comment on two things now in terms of how this book has influenced the study of medieval magic, perhaps partly filling in gaps, but being inspired by some things that are mentioned. I think medieval historians have focused less on the magical aura of the priest before an illiterate laity, and more, as more and more manuscript sources have been uncovered, on the active and enthusiastic choice by some clergy to read, collect, write magic texts and practice magic. But this is already there, so much is in one of these chapters. So we now know more about clerical necromancers, monks adapting magic texts to rituals to ensure salvation, and a very real entanglement of the clergy and magic, religion and magic. For my final point, I want to talk about the history of magic. This is a very rich history of early modern magic. But medieval magic is presented as something fully formed that already exists and sort of has always existed like that. But it also has its own rich history, which changed a lot and developed over the 500 years previous to most of the period of this book. And I can't cover it in this lecture. I just want to talk very briefly about 6 stages, which I see as important. The translation movement of Arabic, Greek and Jewish magic, the way the translators adapted and disseminated these kinds of magic. And for quite a long period after the translations, it was an embrace of occult knowledge and its possibilities, a very positive response. By the end of the 13th century, however, critics were focusing in on aspects of astral magic they thought showed demonic involvement or idolatry. writers and practitioners of magic adapted to this. What we see from the 13th century is an acculturation to Christian forms and sensibilities, not always to mainstream orthodoxy. This can be more transgressive kinds of Christian thinking to do with demons, for example. So then the critics respond to angel magic, theurgy, as it is described in Religion and the Decline of Magic, by making the arguments for why it isn't suitable for a good Christian, and to necromancy, the conjuring of demons, by the early 14th century by coming up with, or in a more intensified way, the idea of the demonic pact. But the creativity of magic and people interested in magic is such that we then have a response to that in the 14th and 15th centuries, which is the emergence of the author magician and theoretical treatises linking astrological expertise to the control of demons. And the sixth and final stage in this history that I would talk about for the Middle Ages is witchcraft and humanism, both of which already in the 15th century are influencing what magic is and how it is presented, and these dialogues between supporters or defenders of magic and their critics. One thing that they have in common is both explore the power and limits of the human capacity to do magic in interesting ways. So I'm going to stop there with just a huge thank you for how inspiring this book has been, but also inspired medieval historians to do things differently and to sort of take on different parts of it in new directions.
Well, thank you very much. I first encountered Religion and the Decline of Magic as an undergraduate at the University of Melbourne. I think I may be the third person. And it left a great impression on me, and it was one of the first academic books that I purchased as a student. My paperback copy includes the date of acquisition, 1988, and I prudently covered it in plastic film as if I knew in advance that I would repeatedly be referring to it over the next 30 years. It sows the seeds for the research proposal that would lead me to Cambridge to study providentialism in early modern England, and it was fitting, if also utterly terrifying, that 4 years later he served as examiner of the thesis that his work had helped to inspire, but which I had the temerity to try to refine. I've been grateful for his forbearance ever since. In one way or another, I've continued to traverse the terrain of Religion and the Decline of Magic throughout my career so far, and revisiting it has alerted me to layers of subtlety and significance in this shimmering and beguiling mosaic that I'd only dimly appreciated before. Perhaps predictably, I want to offer a few comments on how the book treats religion. The first thing to say is that Keith's book took popular religion as a serious subject at a time when it was only just becoming academically respectable to do so. In some sense, like E.P. Thompson, he rescued the people of late medieval and early modern England from the condescension of posterity. I think it's significant that the subtitle of the book is Studies in Popular Beliefs. He thought of the phenomena he explored as systems of belief. The very word implied that these had a coherence, structure, sophistication, and indeed a rationality. Belief is a term that has its roots in theology. It lays claim to embody a form of authenticity and truth. He sometimes placed religious and magical beliefs on an equal footing, both in terms of their effect and of their function. In the final paragraph, he said that the latter, magical beliefs, were not intrinsically less worthy of respect than some of those which we ourselves continue to hold, whether they were parasitic upon Christian teaching or in sharp rivalry to it. Elsewhere, though, magic was presented as a collection of miscellaneous recipes rather than a comprehensive body of doctrine. Medieval Catholicism, as practiced by ordinary people, was a ritual method of living, a mode of behaving, not a set of dogmas or a creed. Keith recognised that what he thought of as the credulities of the rural laity were at odds with the outlook of the clergy, who often disapproved of the tissue of misapprehensions that accumulated around the official rites and sacraments of the Church, though they were also capable of condoning and tolerating them for pious reasons. To this extent, I think the book was still in some sense engaged in the task of sifting the wheat from the chaff and religion from superstition. In spite of itself, it sometimes still works with a hierarchy in which religion is superior to magic. And in the preface, as I think has already been quoted, he said that the beliefs that he reconstructed were all now rightly disdained by intelligent persons. The resulting tension, ambiguity and slippage, I think, is particularly evident in Keith's use of the word superstition. On the one hand, he recognises that this is a polemical and derogatory category by which ecclesiastical leaders demarcated the boundaries between orthodox religion and beliefs and practices that were dubious, not deviant. It was tuned to its subjectivity, relativity and elasticity in ways that foreshadowed more recent work on the phenomenon to which this term was attached in the course of the medieval and early modern era, including that of Stuart Clark. He was attentive to the significance of language as a weapon and a tool in confessional politics, and to the critical part it played in the whole project of the Reformation. He recognised that allowance needed to be made for the exacting standards of clerical elites who bandied this language about, who were quick to denounce as ignorant and heathenish those whom they had, in his words, merely caught out in a mild state of theological confusion. On the other hand, there are times when the book deploys and treats superstition as a form of objective description, and when he takes the claims of these severe divines more at face value. For example, when exploring the utterances of preachers who lamented the superstition in the dark corners of the land. And in this sense, there are some affinities between his depiction of popular religion and that of Jean Delumeau. His own study of Catholicism between Luther and Voltaire, published in French the same year, depicted pre-Reformation religion as superficially Christianized paganism. Keith's account was more careful and nuanced, as even Eamon Duffy conceded in his magnum opus, The Stripping of the Altars. Eamon's index entry to the relevant passage mischievously alerted the reader to this handsome concession. He preferred the term lay Christianity, insisting that it was not helpful to speak of the religion of the people as magical, superstitious, or semi-pagan. I think one of the reasons for this tension that I've been delineating is the approach that Keith adopts. As a self-described historical ethnographer, a student of what he sometimes calls a primitive culture, akin to that discovered by anthropologists working in Africa or Polynesia. He's too meticulous an empiricist to overlook the problems of his sources, but his instinct is also to read them for what they reveal unintentionally and indirectly, to read them like the work of Tudor anthropologists, the term that Alan Macfarlane coined to describe the Essex Puritan minister, George Gifford. In this respect, he perhaps sometimes runs the risk of replicating the ambivalence of these clerical commentators and moralists, and of the later folklorists who followed in their footsteps, an ambivalence born of being torn between fascination and disapproval for the residues and leftovers of previous eras. But this is something of which all of us, to a greater or lesser extent, are guilty. As Keith acknowledges elsewhere, books cannot escape being shaped by their authors' moral values and intellectual assumptions, by the long shadow cast by our formation as scholars, and by the cultural environment in which that occurs. The final observation I want to make briefly is about the picture of the Reformation that Religion in the Decline of Magic paints. I'm struck on rereading it by the extent to which Keith regards the Reformation as a success rather than the failure to which it became more fashionable to suggest it was in revisionist circles subsequently. Part of its long-term success, in his view, is its adaptability, dynamism and creativity, even its capacity to engender what he called a magic of its own. It nevertheless effected a profound transformation. For Keith, at least in the 16th and 17th centuries, this was not really what Weber called the disenchantment of the world. And indeed, I think he presents an impressively balanced account, and probably a more convincing one than some subsequent work, including my own, which has been, I think, in times in danger of overemphasising continuity, doing insufficient justice to change over time, and of throwing the baby out with the bathwater. Rather, what the Protestant Reformation, like other reformations before it and in parallel to it, did was to relocate the boundary between religion and magic. It represented, and this is a key word, itself as an attempt to take the latter out of the former. What it did was to form a new concept of religion itself, a concept that resided in self-conscious adherence to a body of doctrines that found expression in piety, devotion, and lived religion. In this sense, Keith's book delineated the outlines of an argument that's been developed more fully and taken in different directions by other scholars, including in Ethan Shagan's stimulating recent book, The Birth of Modern Belief. It forged a concept of belief that is itself an artifact of a particular historical moment. So religion and the decline of magic thus functions, I think, as an intervention in intellectual as well as social history. Keith opened his book by saying modestly that he would be satisfied if future historians succeed in replacing my tentative generalisations by a more adequate version of the truth. It's a measure of the achievement of the book that this prophecy has not been fulfilled.
Thank you, I asked to go last, partly out of sort of modesty, partly because I thought I'd be zooming out a little bit more than some of the other contributors, and I think I've been proven right, or at least I hope I'll be proven right. So I wanted to begin my 5-6 minutes with a quote taken from one of my other research areas, the history of sainthood. Reading Religion and the Decline of Magic, I was reminded of the words of the 20th century American Catholic social activist Dorothy Day. "Don't call me a saint," the devout Day is meant to have said. "I don't want to be dismissed that easily." Canonization is at least in part a process of domestication, of making something safe, of flattening something for better or for worse. The real Teresa of Avila was a much more daring, enterprising and independent woman than the saint she became in death. Yet conversely, Philip Neri abused his followers in ways reminiscent of modern-day cult leaders, yet he too has been made safe in death as a saint, although one with a particularly strange but harmless sense of humour. And I hope there are no oratorians listening in which case I apologise for that analogy. But the same process, it strikes me, also happens with books, and particularly books that become part of a canon. The early works of Carlo Ginzburg are almost exclusively remembered and appreciated as pioneering works of microhistories, for instance, works about ordinary people, and not for their, controversial, I think still today, claims about the survival of pagan religion. But what about canonizing Religion and the Decline of Magic? How does the real Religion and the Decline of Magic compare with the version that ascended up to historical heaven? So, in the time available, I want to suggest one way in which I think Religion and the Decline of Magic has been exalted above its just deserts, and one way in which we, through canonization or domestication, have lost sight of its inherently radical nature. First of all, RDM, as I'm going to call it for short because it's just too long, RDM, along with Alan Macfarlane's and to a less extent Hugh Trevor Roper's work, forms the basis of a frankly undeserved origin myth for the historiography of witchcraft. That version of witchcraft historiography will be known to many of you. There were the outlandish realist theories of Margaret Murray and Montague Summers from the 1920s, and these were brushed away by Thomas and his colleagues. There once was darkness, and suddenly there was light. So historiographical essays have even advised students not to bother reading anything written on the subject of witchcraft, written prior to the 1960s. And for me, as someone who's recently published a book on the early historiography, the 19th century historiography of witchcraft, that flattened version of the subject is deeply problematic. The juxtaposition with which Sir Keith opens his foreword, and to which both Michael and Alex already hinted, this juxtaposition between the past and the present, that today the magical beliefs are, I quote, widely disdained by intelligent persons, but, to continue that quote, they were taken seriously by intelligent persons in the past, and it is the historian's business to explain why this was so. That same juxtaposition was also the starting point of William Lecky's book, History of the Rise and Influence of the Spirit of Rationalism, which came out in 1865. And Lecky's fascinating and prescient answer, I think, is still worth reading today, and Sir Keith certainly read it in the 1960s. And if I can provide another quote from another work, the responsibility for any witch persecution rests primarily on the community or neighborhood as a whole, and not on the judge or the jury. These words do not come from Religion and the Decline of Magic. They were written by George Lyman Kittredge in 1907. Sir Keith always scrupulously acknowledged his debts, and we once, he may not remember, but we once discussed them over a very pleasant lunch here at All Souls with Robin, and he, particularly his debts to Lecky and Kittredge. And he euphemistically observed that his great rival, Trevor Roper, had made, I quote, spirited use of the scholarship of another early American historian, George Lincoln Burr. The elision of these historians, these early historians, is emphatically not the fault of Religion and the Decline of Magic or its author. In the early modern period, founders of monastic orders were the most common object of canonization, and there is the cult of Luther to consider there too. The canonization of RDM serves as a similar narrative that creates a beginning for the proper study of the history of witchcraft, which obscures a great deal of early scholarship from view, and which also, I think, reveals some problematic impulses that still propel modern witchcraft historiography. Secondly, and more briefly, the need to canonize or domesticate RDM has made the book seem, in my view, less radical than it is. Reviewers and later scholars often use the verb appear when describing the book, what RDM appears to be about, as if they're never quite sure. This is a book ostensibly about, I quote, the decline of magic, but its very last line declares that, I quote, no society will ever be free from it. Sir Keith always saw the other side of an argument. The foreword described the book's method as, I quote, presentation by example and counterexample. And the fact that the book is 800 pages long also does not help. So to critique and criticize the book's conception of both religion and magic, these, of course, are needed to be distilled first from the examples that Keith gives. A fact that is then complicated by his ability to always see the other side, to always prefer to complicate rather than to simplify. And this process of distillation results in an overgeneralized view of RDM, which focuses heavily on the witchcraft chapters, as Jonathan Barry, for instance, did in a 40-plus page review marking the work's 25th anniversary. And sometimes we even zoom in so far as the so-called Thomas Macfarlane model about the role of charity refusal in witchcraft accusations, even though that contains less than a chapter of this book. Other criticisms have focused on the book's source criticism, the use of the infamous envelopes. In my view, it is not so much that these criticisms are wrong, but that they miss RDM's profoundly ethical and profoundly radical purpose. When I was rereading the book over the summer, I was struck by its polyphonous nature. I was also struck by Thomas's well-known observation on page 5 in my Penguin copy about early modern England not being, I quote, a simple, unified, primitive world, but a dynamic and infinitely various society. And I was struck, as Alex was, by the usually ignored subtitle, What the book promises is studies, and I would note the plural here, studies in popular beliefs in 16th and 17th century England. Thomas needed religion and magic and witchcraft and astrology and fairies and prophecies, and he needed 800 pages because they are, in a way, his fields and his fences. And as someone from farming stock, I hope I can make that metaphor to someone else who is a farmer's son. So this project is essentially, RDM is a project to contain the voices of the people of early modern England in all their complexity, in their variety, indeed in their polyphony. And this is for me ultimately why Religion and the Decline of Magic is a timeless work, one from which you pick up new notes and from which you hear new voices at every encounter. Because despite Sir Keith's own remarkably lucid pen, he really is not the real author of RDM. The people of early modern England are, and summarizing, simplifying, domesticating RDM does them a disservice as well. Thank you very much.
One question which has come in from someone watching us, and I think we might deal with that first, and then we can go on to discussion here. And this is from Anonymous, like the previous one, but particularly for Michael Hunter. And the question is, one of the many differences between Keith Thomas's Religion and the Decline of Magic and Michael Hunter's new The Decline of Magic is that while Thomas includes astrology in his book, Hunter openly leaves it out. Can Hunter explain the reasoning behind it? He's had warning of it, but he will now explain.
Yes, I can. I mean, I did think about this, and in fact, I suppose that the studies that led to the decline of magic did actually stem from thinking about religion and the decline of magic, and including astrology. And as some of you may know, I've had edited an astrological diary of Samuel G. Rye, and also published a critique of astrology by the first Astronomer Royal, John Flamsteed. So I did actually at one point wonder about sort of replicating the structure of religion and the kind of magic and including that. But the more I thought about it, the more I thought that wasn't really appropriate. Partly for the reason that I've just mentioned in my comments earlier, that if astrology, why not alchemy? And I do think that is a major problem, that astrology somehow gets into religion and kind of magic, but alchemy doesn't. And yet it could be claimed that for all their ambivalent subjects, but they have the same sort of footing, the occult sciences, and also outside them, that's similar. And I suppose I did actually come to feel that the inclusion of astrology in Religion and the Decline of Magic was perhaps slightly, it's slightly sort of downgraded the intellectual ambitions of the subject, and I thought that was unfortunate. You know, it aligned it with forms of magic which, according to Keith Thomas's account in Religion and the Decline of Magic, were often incoherent and ill understood by those who practiced them. And I felt that did an injustice to the intellectual ambitions of astrology. And I must say that as I worked on the Decline of Magic, I felt that my instinct was justified. I think I refer right near the beginning to an account of superstitions by the 18th century antiquary Francis Grose in his Provincial Glossary, and I say, you know, that the subject matter of his list of superstitions reads like the contents list of Religion and the Decline of Magic, but that does not include astrology. And I felt that, and increasingly as I was writing my book, I felt that the critics who I was mainly concentrating on were concerned with matters like witchcraft and apparitions and ghosts, and not with astrology. And so I think I would justify that for that reason. But I should add that I am fascinated by the issue of the decline of astrology, like Michelle, and will probably write more on it at a later date.
Thank you very much. That's very helpful. Now we can have questions from the floor, and I hope there will be several. Raise your hand. Yes, yes, over there.
Yeah, Alan Strathern. I think this is a question for Alan Macfarlane, really.
Can you shout?
Yeah, so this is my name is Alan Strathern, and this is a question.
Yeah, I know, I've known you since you were a...
Thank you. My question is, there seems to be both a critique of a disenchantment narrative, but also you were saying, we live in a disenchanted world, and most of the world lives in an enchanted world, which actually perfectly describes my own experience of going to Sri Lanka. If I thought I lived in an enchanted world before, spending time there made me realise what an enchanted world really felt like. So I'm wondering that the problem with notions of enchantment and disenchantment always existing in a yin-yang or even in cycles is that those cycles don't go anywhere. Maybe this is partly what Alexandra Walsham meant about not throwing the baby out with the bathwater. So I'm wondering how we can have a narrative of disenchantment that fully recognises how profoundly different we are in the West in certain ways, but also understands processes of re-enchantment.
Thank you. I'll stand up so you can. That's a very good question. My solution is that there are two main forms of disenchantment. There is the kind of of enchantment. There's the kind that I experienced in Nepal, China, Japan, and is present in most of the world. And that is that everyone is enchanted. It's Weber's magical garden. It's basically the world is enchanted, the rocks and the trees and the stones. It's shamanism. It's Descolat's shamanic world. And 3/4 of the world now is like that. And continental Europe is somewhat like that, but not so much. But the Anglosphere is different. But that doesn't mean we're disenchanted. We have what I used to call oasis enchantment. But now, thanks to Kate Fox, I call bubble enchantment. That is basically a bubble moves with you. Basically, when I say to my granddaughters, let's pretend to be tigers, we are in an enchanted world, the world of fairies and so on. When we start listening to music, we become, in other words, it's the disengagement from the here and now. When you watch a game of football, so most of our activity, when our minds go out into something, a different level. And this, for us, the way we manage to maintain a certain amount of efficiency and rationality is that our productive organizations, our economies and so on are vaguely efficient and disenchanted. But the people who work within them, much of their time is lived within a bubble or an oasis. So putting it another way, as I thought about it, if you think of a Japanese rock garden, you have the rocks and the sand. In Japan, China, and the rest, the sand is enchanted. Almost everything is enchanted, but you have these little peaks of disenchantment and rationality. Here, we're the other way around, that we have theoretically a rational and disenchanted world, but we have all the time all these escapes. And if we didn't, that's where I agree with Chris. If you took away enchantment, in other words, you banned all music, I mean, the one religion that tries to stop us being enchanted is Islam, or extreme forms of Islam. Anything like pictorial representations, like music, like poetry, is banned because it's basically Plato's nightmare. In other words, poetry and other things like that, Plato, as you know, was opposed to, because your rational thinking self becomes possessed by something which you can't control. And so we live much of our time in these, we move from one to the other. A nice meal in All Souls is a form of enchantment, a conversation with an old friend is a form of enchantment. So I broaden the definition hugely, as you see, but it basically means the loss of the controlling means ends rationality that Weber is talking about to a wider form of involvement, either in nature. So the whole romantic poetry movement, which Keith and I both admire, Wordsworth and so on, that is what Wordsworth's poetry is about, the move from that kind of enchanted world to our supposedly rational world. But I don't think it happens. And what my autobiographical books now are about are rediscovering this by writing the history of my life and thinking I was moving towards a Weberian disenchanted world. That was what I was told, that's what I believed when I was taught by Keith, that's what my book was about. But I don't think it's right. I don't think it's happened, and it hasn't happened to me. So I've rediscovered a much richer kind of, and that's what I think Chris is pointing to. We have to move towards that. And the one question that I had in relation to Chris and others, when we're thinking about why we are much more interested in, whatever you like to call it, magic and enchantment, I think one of the reasons is that we are basically becoming Chinese. That basically the influence of non-monotheistic, binary Western Greek thinking, which I was brought up in, that sweeping influence which is coming in very strongly from Buddhism, from Taoism, from non-Western sources, is like, as it is doing with our politics and our economics, it is making us doubt the tradition in which we were brought up. That's certainly how it's happened to me. It was going to China and Japan that I realized what real enchant was. Then when I came back here, I found it was the same here, really, but in a different way.
Thank you. Yes. Good.
It's interesting because we haven't spoken at all about the rest of the world, and now the rest of the world has come in. And I find it, again, about a historical conjuncture. It's very interesting if you look at the emergence of Buddhist modernism or Hindu universalism, that their relationship to what was religious, spiritual, or magical had to be very different from the West, precisely because it was what distinguished it, the spiritual, from Western preoccupations. That was where they had primacy. I think it's interesting also that astrology plays a big part. For example, Buddhist monks in Sri Lanka who found it extremely difficult to give up astrology as a science because the Buddha and Buddhist science was meant to have discovered real science thousands of years before the West, whether it be through karmic knowledge and evolution. These kinds of ideas were very, very prominent. And the reason why I raise them is because I think that it partially explains why it is very different in different parts of the world. In India, you could be invested in Vedanta at the same time that you were deeply invested in the normative knowledge of science. There was no decision to disenchant the world in the same way. In fact, it was seen as vital to anti-imperialism to keep the unity and to shift that way of thinking. So I think that may help us.
Thank you. Thank you. Other questions? Yes, Brian.
Could I just make a comment rather than a question? I do agree very much with what was said about Keith's book being very radical. And I think one realizes that more if one says something about where it came from. It came from a syllabus that was entirely dominated by politics, and even worse than that, by constitutional history. And it was, I think, Keith who said somewhere that he never raised any of the subjects in RDM, as you all call it, in tutorials. It just didn't seem relevant to the syllabus he was supposed to be teaching. So it's a deeply conservative and traditional background that he comes from intellectually. And I epitomise that by two comments that I overheard or was told. One was from Harry Pitt, who was the tutor at Worcester, when he said simply incidentally, not specifically to me, that social history really wasn't really tough stuff. It wasn't the hard stuff that one studied in politics. And the second comment was never really a comment, it was a gossip really, on high tables, that Keith was bonga bonga Thomas. That is, he studied worthless people in Africa or Asia or whatever. And these were regarded really, not explicitly said as racially inferior, but it's implied that they are. And it's something obviously that Keith never began to think of thinking. And I remember he ticked me off once in a tutorial, quite rightly, when I suggested that people who were mixed race were politically unstable. That was a typical thing about Keith. He didn't say that's wrong or that's a mistaken comment. He just said, look, what's your evidence for saying it? And I had to rethink. So I think if you come from this climate, the book is really quite remarkable.
Could I comment there?
Yes.
Of course, Keith was taught at Balliol by Dick Southern, who was notorious for never teaching anything that would be examined on the syllabus. And if you ask Keith, he will tell you about his revision tutorials, I think, where Southern was persuaded to teach him about the Norman conquest. Actually, Southern's inaugural lecture remains something that anybody should read, I think. An absolute denunciation of the Oxford History School as being only interested in all the wrong things and in none of the interesting things. So perhaps it wasn't totally without some sort of precedent. But I mean, I heard that inaugural lecture in my first year, and of course it went completely over my head. I had no idea, except I noticed a lot of people squirming.
Yes, Robin and I were contemporaries, of course, and he will remember as well as I do that the past and present article on history and anthropology, which was partly a tribute to Evans Pritchard, occasioned an examination question in the schools to the effect, is anthropology of any use to historians? Something like that. When I had my viva, a well-known historian called John Cooper said to me, do you really think that anthropology is of any use at all? To which I responded, yes, sir. The article was a very, very radical break.
Trevor Roper wrote an article in the Sunday paper about his experience as a schools examiner, and he complained that they wave their hands and prattle of anthropology.
Can I also mention sort of like, Sir Keith's early interest in women's history, which he, according to the biography you published, Paul, he was encouraged to hide if he wanted to have any chance of getting his job at St. John's College.
Well, it wasn't just on women's history, it was on history of sex.
But I remember if we're reminiscing, what was very striking about, I don't know when Keith started his graduate seminar, but whichever year it was in the 70s, all the members of the faculty came, or a lot of them came, a lot of the doubters about the value of social history were there. They wanted to know what Keith was going to say. I remember one memorable paper of his about pretenders to the throne, or Edward VI coming back again. And John Cooper, who had been so critical of anthropology, was sitting there taking notes. I mean, it was a very striking turn. Brian is quite right. A very striking turnaround in the nature of the history faculty, I think.
I think so. Just a footnote. I was taught by Harry Pitt for 3 years at Worcester, and I used to complain to him. I said, why do we get just this political and constitutional and sometimes a bit of economic history? And he said, and I got letters from him saying, you know, the other kind doesn't really exist, and I don't really believe in anthropology. I've got some letters of that kind. So when I came to do my DPhil, I thought I'm going to either do something entirely different. So I really, all I wanted was to be supervised by Christopher Hill. He was my hero. So I went to see Christopher, and we stumbled along for a few weeks on something. And then he said, this is no good. What do you really want to do? And I said, myth, witchcraft, or sex? And he said, the man for you. And then he ended with a slight smile. He said, Keith knows much more about sex than I do, at least in the 17th century.
Other question. Yes.
Ian McLean, can I make sense or do I have to stand up?
Could you stand up?
I hope the two sessions we've had are porous, and therefore I can go back to a question that was raised by Robin. I heard it was raised, in a sense, in response to something else, namely what would have happened had there been a French version of religion and the kind of magic, and why isn't it in existence? Well, we've already had reference to Delumeau, who did that sort of thing. A quite different name came to my mind, which was Paul Venn, and who was a practicing ancient historian, a very good one, and also a writer on historical theory. But he also wrote the book Les Grecs ont-ils cru à l'homme? Did the Greeks believe in their myths? And he sort of triangulated a historical notion of truth with history itself, and with the question of belief in a very ingenious way. And so I think there is a style of writing which I would recognise as an Oxford historical style of writing, which is very opposed to what might have come out of France had someone found the sources which Robin correctly said probably are not available in France, and then set about writing it. And what came to my mind as the difference between the two was a cartoon that appeared in Punch in the 1960s, which is not about the difference between French and English or Anglo-Saxon history, but the difference between Oxford philosophy and French philosophy. And the cartoon was a picture where there was a sort of two people, one sort of slightly inanely smiling, standing next to an inverted pyramid, which began with one fact and ended up with a massive construction with extraordinary abstractions at the top, and that was French philosophy. And then on the other side, there was a picture of English philosophy, which was a person of very sober appearance, you know, with a tie on and everything else, carefully putting one brick on top of another. And it seems to me that there is something about this in terms of style, which is encapsulated by Paul Venn's, I think, quite extraordinary work, which I think has at least one other reader in the room, and where one could find the discussion of what Diodorus said about Hercules, which Freud didn't have as evidence, and you know, bits of anthropological information, such as the Ethiopian tribe that believes that leopards are Christian beasts because they feast at the same time of the year as the Christians do. But it didn't prevent them, on the other hand, trying to put up barricades to stop the leopards getting at their beasts. So he did introduce, as it were, a very broad range of things, together with a very large number of abstractions and abstractive vocabulary, which is not, of course, a feature of Oxford writing.
So, again, if you were me, what would you say? We're starting actually 5 minutes early, so I was only going to make one sentence, but now I'm going to make 3 or 4. The one sentence was that you want to hear Keith, not me, so let's move on. The 3 or 4 are, we've just concentrated on Keith's book, but I can't miss this opportunity to thank Keith for all he's done for me and for many of you. He was an extraordinary supervisor, as you'll see in the autobiographical of the volumes, if you want to look at them at the end of my handout. But for the following 50, 60 years, he's been extraordinary. He's read everything I've sent to him, about 20 books, been through them word by word, sending me lists of mistakes on each occasion, longer or shorter, and helped me in innumerable ways. I've supervised a lot of students, and I've never been as generous with my time or attention as Keith was to me. So even if he hadn't written a great book, he is a great man for that. So that's just a personal note to introduce him and embarrass him slightly before he replies to all our comments. So now I want to just give the floor to Keith.
Well, I need hardly say how very touched I am that the organisers of this conference should have recognised my book, 50 years old, and that many of you have been speakers, have been so kind as to breathe new life into its ancient corpse. I wish you could have done the same for its elderly author. I'm all the more pleased that you've been discussing the book's content rather than its price, because that wasn't at all what happened in 1971 when the book was first published. The TLS helpfully printed a very generous review written by an old friend who, as it happens, is sitting not very far from where I am now. But the ensuing correspondence was wholly devoted not to the subject of the book, but to its price, and indeed not unreasonably so. My reluctant publisher, Weidenfeld and Nicholson, had only accepted the book because their talent scout, who was Eric Hobsbawm, had pressed them to do so. They had very low expectations of its saleability and therefore priced it at £8, which, according to the Office for National Statistics, is in today's money the equivalent of £115. It was worth every penny, of course. But I did think it was rather on the high side. One of those who defended the price was Mr. Brown, who ran the invaluable department for foreign books in Parker's Bookshop, Broad Street, Oxford. Later, alas, the shop was extinguished by an extension to Exeter College, leaving Oxford without a bookshop, selling non-British books. Mr. Brown's heart was in the right place. It was a sad state of affairs, he said, when book lovers were shocked that a book could cost £8. If one takes one's wife to London to the theatre, he wrote, and includes the cost of the fare and a meal, greatly helped by much too generous reviews written by my former tutor, Christopher Hill, my former pupils, Peter Burke and Paul Stack, and other old pals, including Charles Webster, Hugh Carney, Robert Ashton, and of course, Robin Briggs. So my advice to young authors is to spend less time in the Bodleians and more time socializing with your literary friends who will do you proud when your book, much delayed of course by all this socializing, when your book eventually comes out. Well, how did I come to write a book on magic and religion? To some extent, it arose from my interest in anthropology, whose value for historians I had urged in an article for Past and Present.
But as so often in my life, it was largely a matter of chance. I was a tutorial fellow of St John's and used to give a university class with my colleague, John Cooper of Trinity, on the special subject, Commonwealth and Protectorate. In alternate weeks, John and I took turns to deliver a paper on some aspect of the subject. There was a certain amount of competitive cookery about this, and we both worked quite hard on our papers, several of which were subsequently published. I suspect that some of you, perhaps most of you, have never heard of John Cooper, but he was a profound scholar, albeit with a somewhat irascible temperament, and he did not subscribe to Hugh Trevor Roper's concept of fertile error. So, in the weeks when it was my turn to perform, I took a great deal of trouble to make sure that I'd got things right. My first assignment was to give a paper on the Levellers, the radical proto-democratic group who came into prominence in 1647. Off I went to the Bodleian to see what unpublished manuscripts there might be relating to the Levellers. The answer was not many. But one of them was a letter of April 1648, handwritten by one of the more prominent Leveller leaders, Richard Overton. The letter was to the astrologer William Lilly, and it asked him to use his art to determine whether he, Overton, ought to go on being a Leveller, or as he put it, whether by joining with the agents of the private soldiery of the army for the redemption of common right and freedom to the land and removal of oppressions from the people, my endeavour shall be prosperous or no. The letter was pinned inside one of these casebooks, which proved to contain hundreds of similar inquiries from a huge range of very diverse clients, many of them looking extremely interesting. But more than anything else, it was the fact that Overton, this intellectually sophisticated and what we would call rationalist thinker, should have gone to Lilly to help him make the critical decision as to whether or not to continue with his campaign, which it was that which convinced me that astrology was a topic worth investigating. And I'm glad to see that Dr. Michelle Pfeffer is currently doing so. The other lesson I learned from Lilly's casebooks was that one of the questions most frequently asked by his clients was that of whether or not they'd been bewitched. As a result, my subsequent inquiries into witchcraft and magic would constitute the nucleus of my book, though I widened it out considerably to include discussions of religion, both before and after the Reformation, along with thoughts on ancient prophecies, ghosts, fairies, and other associated topics. A powerful stimulus came from my first graduate student, Alan Macfarlane, who, after toying with the idea of writing on the history of education, embarked on what proved to be a very fine doctoral thesis entitled Witchcraft Prosecutions in Essex, 1560-1680, the basis of a book he published in 1970. Alan wrote it at the time when I was writing my book, and we saw a lot of each other and had wonderfully enjoyable and constructive discussions from which I certainly gained a lot, and so I hope did he. It took me 5 years to write my book in the intervals of teaching. I began in January 1965, when I started on the first of what would be 3 chapters on astrology. I was on sabbatical leave from St John's, and I clearly remember tipping out my notes onto the table in a little room into Gerald and Ursula Aylmer's cottage in Langgrove, Herefordshire. With their characteristic kindness, they had let Valerie and me use it as a way of getting away from the distractions of Oxford. When my leave ended, the remaining chapters were written in our college house, 55 Woodstock Road, usually after dinner, something I could never do now. I had almost finished writing the book by January 1970, when I was due to spend a semester as a visiting professor at Louisiana State University, Baton Rouge. My St John's colleague, Howard Colvin, who'd never heard of Baton Rouge, aptly remarked that the name would be much more appropriate for a herald than a city. And accompanied by two small children, and much more important, the unique type draft of my book, we got there by travelling from Southampton on a banana boat to Kingston, Jamaica, then crossing to the north of the island by bus, flying from Montego Bay to New Orleans, and finally enduring a 2-hour car ride in blazing heat without air conditioning to Baton Rouge. The bus journey across Jamaica was not without its hazards, as part of the floor of the rather decrepit bus fell out, and I was recruited to hold the piece of string which kept it in place after it had been mended. With my other hand, I firmly touched my touchscreen. When at last we got to the flats assigned to us in Baton Rouge, the children were much cheered to know that an alligator had recently been found in the drain. Despite all these adventures, I finished the book, and it was published in the spring of 1971. Of course, I left a good deal out, and Ian Bostridge was one of those who helpfully filled a gap with his own book, Witchcraft and Its Transformations, which, as it happens, helpfully sang a rather different tune. The main criticism made by the reviewers was perfectly fair, namely that the book was too insular, and that I should have said more about the differences between the English story and the handling of prosecution of magic and witchcraft in Scotland and on the continent, where the law and judicial procedures were different. In fact, it was a good job that I didn't try, as Robin Briggs would have murdered my ill-informed attempts to describe the situation in France. Another serious omission is alchemy. I think I didn't care for alchemy. I hated chemistry lessons. I think the reason I didn't go any further with it. Another fair criticism was that I underplayed the role of the English establishment in encouraging trials and convictions. I failed to mention the intervention of the Attorney for Witchcraft. I failed to mention the intervention of the Attorney Generals of Gilbert Gerard in the 1566 Chelmsford trial, or the role of the returned bishops in encouraging witchcraft prosecutions, or the bigotry of Chief Justice Sir Matthew Hale, who in 1662 obtained the conviction and execution of 2 old women, both widows, at the various St. Edmund's trial, by refraining from commenting on the evidence, but strongly asserting the existence of dangerous witches. I could list other valid criticisms of the book, but I shan't do so, because as Edward Gibbon said in reply to criticisms of his much greater book than mine, if error is irreparable, repentance is useless.